The most dangerous document in California is not classified. It is a free file sitting on a United States Geological Survey server. It has been public since 2008, and it describes in flat bureaucratic language exactly what happens to Southern California when the southern San Andreas fault finally lets go. Most people assume the danger of the big one is the shaking, the buildings folding, the freeway decks dropping, the 60 seconds of chaos everyone has seen in a movie. The reason the scientists who wrote that document lose sleep is not the shaking. It is not the collapse, it is what happens on day 3 and day 30 and day 200, after the ground has gone quiet and the water still has not come back. The USGS ShakeOut Scenario puts hard numbers on it. A magnitude 7.8 rupture on the southern San Andreas kills roughly 1,800 people, injures 50,000, causes $200 billion in direct damage, and pushes 500,000 residents out of their homes. That single event is about 5,000 times larger than the magnitude 5.4 that rattled Southern California on July 29, 2008, the one most people barely remember. More than 20 million people live inside the zone that document describes, and the fault it describes is still loading right now, under the freeway you drive on. This is the part of the story that almost no one is telling. Before we go any further, I want to be upfront about something. This scenario is hypothetical. It is a planning exercise, not a forecast, and nobody at the USGS or anywhere else can predict the date of an earthquake. Agencies write planning documents constantly, and on its own, one more scenario report is nothing unusual. What makes this particular document worth a full breakdown is not the body count in the headline. It is the fact that these are the government's own numbers, produced by more than 300 scientists and engineers, and that the second half of the document, the part about water and fire, describes a failure that keeps running for a year after the shaking stops. If that kind of breakdown is what you come here for, subscribe now, because this fault does not wait for anyone's schedule. Here is what the record actually says. The ShakeOut Scenario was released in 2008 by the U.S. Geological Survey and the California Geological Survey as USGS Open File Report 2008-1150, paired with California Geological Survey Preliminary Report 25, and it was presented to Congress on May 22, 2008. The modeled rupture begins near Bombay Beach at the Salton Sea and tears northwest along roughly 300 kilometers of the southern San Andreas. Fault offsets in the model reach 13 meters, and up to 8 meters at the points where pipelines, roads, and power lines cross the break. Physics-based simulations produced peak ground velocities of 3 meters per second near the fault, with velocities above half a meter per second across more than 10,000 square kilometers. The scenario posits 1,800 deaths and roughly 50,000 injuries requiring emergency room care, with the peer-reviewed version published in Earthquake Spectra in 2011 listing 53,000. It counts approximately 1,600 fire ignitions, destroying 200 million square feet of building stock, which the authors translate as the equivalent of 133,000 single-family homes. Total losses are given as $200 billion in the public summary and $213 billion in some of the supplementary tallies, with the Earthquake Spectra paper breaking out $191 billion in economic loss. 500,000 residents are displaced. Those numbers were not revised downward in the years since, and the document remains the operational baseline for the largest earthquake drill in the world, which Californians still run every October. It is not an archive piece. It is the plan currently in force, and every year that passes without the rupture, the assumption underneath it gets heavier. To understand why the number is that large, you have to understand what the fault has been doing every single day since the last time it broke. The San Andreas is not a crack in the ground. It is the seam where two pieces of the Earth's outer shell grind past each other, the Pacific plate sliding northwest relative to North America, and along the southern strand studied by Kimberly Blisnook and colleagues in Science Advances in 2021, that motion runs at about 24 millimeters a year. 24 millimeters is about the width of your thumb. That sounds harmless. It is not harmless. Because the fault is locked. The two sides are not sliding smoothly past each other at the surface. They are stuck by friction, while the rock behind them keeps moving at thumb width per year, which means the crust on either side is bending like a steel ruler pressed between two hands. You can feel that in your own fingers. The ruler holds and gives no warning at all, and then it releases everything it stored in one motion. The southernmost stretch of the San Andreas has not released since roughly 1680, with some paleoseismic work placing the last rupture near 1726. Take 3 centuries at 2.5 centimeters a year, and you get somewhere between 6 and 7 meters of stored slip waiting to come out. That is the 13-meter offset in the shakeout model, and it is why the number is not arbitrary. We know the fault does this repeatedly because someone went and dug it up. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Carey C. of Caltech cut trenches into the marsh sediments at Pallett Creek, a site near Wrightwood about 55 kilometers northeast of Los Angeles where the San Andreas runs through soft, layered ground. What he found reads like pages in a book. Each large earthquake liquefied the wet sediment, blew sand up through the layers, and snapped the beds apart, and then the marsh quietly buried the damage under new material until the next one. Radiocarbon dating of the organic layers gave him a calendar. The record at that site holds roughly 10 large earthquakes over the past 2,000 years, with an average interval that later analyses placed around 132 to 145 years, and work by Catherine Scherer and colleagues using higher precision dating put the mean interval from the middle of the sequence to 185.7 at about 135 years. But the average hides the important part. Individual gaps in that record range from under a century to 2 and 3 centuries, which is why no honest scientist gives you a due date. The fault is not a metronome. It is a system that stores load until something gives, and the record only tells you it has given, over and over, on ground that now carries commuter traffic. Magnitude confuses people, so let me anchor it. The scale is logarithmic, meaning each whole step up multiplies the energy released by roughly 32 times. A 6 is not twice a 5, it is dozens of times a 5. Step from the magnitude 5.4 of July 29, 2008 to a magnitude 7.8, and you are climbing 2.4 steps. Which is why the ShakeOut event is described as thousands of times larger, around 5,000 times by the comparison used with the 2008 event. But energy is only half of it. The other half is duration. Northridge in 1994 was a magnitude 6.7, and the strong shaking lasted somewhere around 7 to 15 seconds. Historical accounts of the 1857 Fort Tejon earthquake, the last true big one on this fault, describe strong shaking that ran 1 to 3 minutes. Think about what that means physically. A building does not fail because it gets hit once. It fails because it gets pushed and released and pushed again, and each cycle opens the cracks a little wider until the frame gives up. 3 minutes is a different kind of event from 15 seconds, and every structure in the region is going to be asked that question at the same moment. There is one more piece of the mechanism that decides who gets hurt, and it has nothing to do with distance from the fault. Los Angeles sits in a sedimentary basin, a deep bowl of soft sediment shed off the mountains over millions of years. When seismic waves leave hard bedrock and enter that soft fill, they slow down. And as they slow, they grow taller, the same way an ocean swell that crosses deep water quietly rears up into a breaker when it hits the shallow shelf. The basin also traps the waves. They bounce off the edges and keep sloshing after the fault has stopped moving, which stretches the shaking well past the duration of the rupture itself. Worse, the chain of basins running from San Bernardino through the Chino Hills toward downtown behaves like a waveguide, a natural channel that funnels energy along its length toward the densest part of the region. That is why the ShakeOut maps show violent motion in places that are more than 50 kilometers from the fault trace. Distance buys you less than intuition promises, and the ground under the largest population center in the American West is the wrong kind of ground. But here is the part that almost no one is covering, and it is the reason that document reads the way it does. The shaking is not where most of the loss comes from. In the ShakeOut accounting published in Earthquake Spectra, fire alone contributes $87 billion in property and business interruption loss out of the total, while direct shake damage to buildings and contents comes to $46 billion, and business interruption caused by water outages adds another $24 billion. Read that again. The fires and the water failure together account for roughly 2/3 of the loss. The earthquake is the trigger. The catastrophe is what the earthquake does to the plumbing. Southern California does not have its own water. It imports the majority of what it drinks, and Los Angeles imports something like 85 to 90% of it through 3 enormous aqueducts, the Los Angeles Aqueduct, the California Aqueduct, and the Colorado River Aqueduct. Those 3 systems deliver more than 70% of the region's annual supply. Every single one of them crosses the San Andreas Fault. There is no way to bring water into the basin from the north or the east without crossing it, a problem engineers have understood since William Mulholland's era, and no pipe ever built can absorb 4 to 8 meters of sideways offset in a few seconds. The study by Craig Davis of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power and Thomas O'Rourke of Cornell, published in Earthquake Spectra in 2011, simulated the entire Los Angeles system, all 11,691 kilometers of trunk and distribution pipeline, and put aqueduct restoration at somewhere between 4 and 18 months. Local emergency storage covers roughly 6 months, and only with severe rationing. The gap between those two numbers is the part that should make you sit up. And that gap opens on the day of the rupture, not months later. Zoom in on one piece of that plumbing, and the exposure gets uncomfortably specific. Water arriving from the Owens Valley reaches Los Angeles through the Elizabeth Tunnel, a bore driven through the mountains more than a century ago that passes directly through the San Andreas fault zone, and engineering assessments of that crossing describe moderate rock quality inside the fault and poor rock quality south of it. Close to 4 million people receive water that moves through that one tunnel. The Los Angeles Department of Water and Power has been working on seismic enhancements there, installing flexible, high-density polyethylene pipe sections across the fault zone during brief shutdown windows, precisely because a rigid tunnel through a moving fault is not a survivable design. That work exists because the agency read the same scenario you are hearing about now, and the fix is partial by design, meant to improve the odds that some water still arrives rather than to guarantee it. The economic tail is longer than the repair schedule. The Davis and O'Rourke simulation found that restoring service to all customers takes several months, and that getting back to pre-earthquake water demand takes more than a year, which means businesses across the region operate under rationing long after the news trucks leave. That is where the $24 billion water-related business interruption figure comes from, and it lands on an economy that includes the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, the largest container gateway in the country, plus the warehouse and distribution belt of the Inland Empire that feeds retail shelves across the western United States. A regional water failure of that duration is not a Southern California story. It is a supply chain story with a national footprint, and it starts on a fault line that most of the people it would touch have never thought about. Now stack the fire on top of it. Those 1,600 ignitions in the model start the way they always start after a big quake, from broken gas lines, from arcing electrical service, from water heaters knocked off their feet, from stoves shaken onto floors. At that exact moment, the distribution network under the streets is full of leaks, thousands of them, and pressure in the hydrants collapses. Firefighters arrive at burning blocks and open a hydrant that produces nothing. This is not speculation about the future, it is the pattern from San Francisco in 1906 and Kobe in 1995, and the ShakeOut modelers built it into the scenario deliberately. The detail that unsettles me most is that they ran that fire model without Santa Ana winds. No wind event. A calm day. 1,600 fires burning through 200 million square feet of building stock on the most favorable weather assumption the authors could reasonably make, and the fire loss still comes out as the single largest line item in the ledger. What that assumption is quietly telling you is that the real number has room to move in only one direction. That was the state of knowledge for most of the past 2 decades. Then, in June of 2026, the picture got sharper. A study led by Liliane Burkhard, published in the Journal of Geophysical Research, Solid Earth, on June 3, 2026, with co-authors Bridget Smith-Conter, Catherine Scherer of the USGS, and David Sandwell of Scripps, reconstructed 1,000 years of stress accumulation across the southern San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems. Their model puts the San Jacinto Bernardino segment at 3.6 megapascals of accumulated stress, above its previous 1,000-year peak of about 2.9 megapascals, a level last reached just before that piece of fault ruptured in the year 1249. The Mojave South segment north of San Bernardino sits at 2.8 megapascals, also its highest reading in 10 centuries. In the University of Hawaii announcement of the work on June 10, 2026, Burkhard described a region where more than 160 years have passed since the last major rupture, and said the system is in a critically loaded state. Those are the words of the lead author of a peer-reviewed paper, not a headline writer. The second finding is the one that changes the map. The team identified Cajon Pass, the narrow gap northeast of San Bernardino where the San Andreas and the San Jacinto faults come within reach of each other, as what they call an earthquake gate. In their 1,000-year reconstruction, ruptures crossed that junction and involved both fault systems, when the stress on either side was closely matched, with a difference of about 0.3 megapascals. Today that difference measures around 0.8 megapascals and is closing. Burkhard has told reporters that a joint rupture crossing the pass could reach magnitudes in the range of 7.4 to 7.8, while affecting a considerably larger area than a single fault event. And Cajon Pass is not empty ground. Interstate 15 runs through it. So does the main freight rail line into the Inland Empire, along with high-voltage transmission, natural gas transmission, and fiber. It is simultaneously the hinge that decides how big the rupture gets and the corridor that everything depends on afterward. That is what is loading, this week, while nothing appears to be happening. The last time this fault did what the document describes, almost nobody was standing on it. On the morning of January 9, 1857, the San Andreas broke for about 225 miles from near Parkfield to the Wrightwood area, with horizontal offset reaching 9 meters on the Carrizo Plain, according to the USGS summary of the event. The shaking was felt across more than 350,000 square kilometers, and it killed one person. One. She was a woman inside an adobe house near Gorman, in the Tejon Pass corridor, and the walls came in on her while the ground was still moving. The other details that survive are strange and physical in a way that maps do not capture. The Kern River reversed direction and ran 4 feet deep over its banks. Tulare Lake sloshed so hard that fish were thrown miles inland onto dry ground, and contemporary accounts describe the sky filling with buzzards and vultures over a lake bed littered with them. Artesian wells in the Santa Clara Valley stopped flowing while new springs opened near Santa Barbara and San Fernando. That single death is not evidence of a gentle earthquake. It is evidence of an empty state, a California of scattered adobe ranches and one inland road. That same rupture line now runs beneath Wrightwood, Palmdale, Fraser Park, and the Gorman exit on Interstate 5, where roughly 60,000 vehicles a day move the goods that feed the second largest metropolitan area in the country. The house that fell on that woman is gone. The fault under it is still there, and it is 169 years further along in its cycle than it was that morning. To keep this danger properly in proportion, look at the base rate rather than the headline. The USGS Third Uniform California Earthquake Rupture Forecast, UCERF3, puts the probability of at least one magnitude 6.7 or larger earthquake somewhere in Southern California at 93% over the 30 years from 2014 to 2044. For the specific case of a magnitude 8 or larger anywhere in California, USERF3 raised the estimate from the 4.7% of the older model to about 7% over 30 years. A 93% chance across 3 decades is roughly a 1 in 14 chance in any given year. That is high enough to write building codes around and to justify keeping 2 weeks of water in a garage. It is not a countdown clock, and anyone who tells you the fault is due next month is selling something. The useful comparison is Northridge. On January 17, 1994, a magnitude 6.7 struck under the San Fernando Valley, killing 57 people, injuring thousands, and producing tens of billions of dollars in damage from roughly 15 seconds of shaking on a fault that does not even reach the surface. Northridge was a fraction of the energy in the ShakeOut model, and it still became one of the costliest disasters in American history. The transferable lesson is that magnitude alone does not determine outcome. Duration, depth, basin geometry, and what happens to the water and gas systems afterward decide the ledger. What the data does and does not tell us needs saying plainly. It tells us the southern San Andreas has gone longer than its typical interval between major ruptures, that measured strain is at or above 1,000-year highs on several segments, and that the built consequences of a 7.8 have been modeled in unusual detail. It does not tell us the year, the month, or the day. It does not tell us the rupture will start at Bombay Beach rather than somewhere else, and it does not tell us whether the gate at Cajon Pass opens or holds. Rare is a fair word here. Finished is not. The interval is not evidence of safety, it is the mechanism by which the load accumulates. So here is what you can actually do with all of this, and every item below is chosen because it addresses a specific failure documented in the scenario itself. Store water for 2 weeks per person, not 3 days, at 1 gallon per person per day, and store it because the aqueduct restoration estimate in the Davis and O'Rourke study is 4 to 18 months, not 72 hours. Strap your water heater to the wall studs with metal strapping at the top and bottom third, because an unstrapped heater is both a common ignition source and, once secured, a reserve of 40 or more gallons of drinkable water. Learn where your gas shutoff is and buy the wrench, and here is the counterintuitive half of that instruction. Do not shut the gas off reflexively after shaking. Turn it off only if you smell gas, hear hissing, or see damage to the meter, because utilities can take weeks to restore service house by house, and a needlessly closed valve in January is its own emergency. Enable earthquake alerts on your phone through Shake Alert or MyShake, since the warning arrives seconds ahead of the waves, and seconds is enough to get under a table or off a ladder. Find out what your building is made of, specifically whether it is unreinforced masonry, a soft-story apartment over an open parking garage, or a pre-1980 structure, because those 3 categories carry most of the collapse risk and retrofit programs exist for all of them. Keep a fire extinguisher on every floor and know that in the first days you may be your own fire department, since the hydrants in the model run dry exactly when 1,600 fires are burning. Designate an out-of-area contact and have everyone text rather than call, because local circuits jam while messages routed out of the region often still move. And keep shoes and a flashlight tied to the leg of your bed, because broken glass in the dark is the injury that turns a survivable night into an emergency room visit you cannot get to. None of that is fear. All of it is leverage. And it only makes sense because the event sits in front of us rather than behind us. 3 things are worth watching over the coming months: the USGS Earthquake Hazards Program and the Southern California Seismic Network, for any change in activity along the Coachella and San Bernardino segments and around Bombay Beach where the modeled rupture begins. The follow-up work to the Burkhardt study coming out of the statewide California Earthquake Center, which will test whether that 0.8 megapascal gap at Cajon Pass keeps narrowing, and the Great Shakeout in October, which is the one moment each year when the plan in that document gets rehearsed at scale. I will be watching the USGS publications and the SEC updates closely, and I will bring you anything that moves. Subscribe so the next update finds you. The fault is loading tonight, the document is already written, and the only part still unwritten is how ready the 20 million people living on top of it choose to be. Stay safe out there.